Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar, where we're going to be focusing on your CV and covering off on some of the myths versus the reality. Just before we start, a couple of admin points. As you can probably see on your screen, to the right-hand side, you'll have a panel there. If that panel is in the way and you want to hide it, you can do that by clicking the icon that's shown on your screen. Equally, if you would like to ask a question at any point during the webinar, please do type it into the box where you can see highlighted again on the screen, and we will either answer them as we go along if appropriate. Otherwise, there'll be time at the end for your questions. So just to introduce myself, my name is Lisa Jones. I'm one of the career consultants here at the Officers Association. I myself was in the Army for 8 years, and when I left, I worked in the city in financial services for a couple of investment banks. While I was there, I also did a bit of recruitment, and I worked on graduate recruitment programs, so I've analysed a fair few CVs in my time. However, tonight's expert is Giles O'Halloran, who we're very fortunate in having this evening, and what I'm going to do is allow Giles himself to introduce himself. Good evening, Giles.
Hello, Lisa, and good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for that. So, thank you for the intro, Lisa, and good evening again. So, just to give it a background to myself, so I was kindly invited to join this call and the webinar, and I'm delighted to do so. So, my background is I'm very much an HR and recruitment talent sort of specialist. I now operate as a freelance HR strategist for myself and work for a number of different organisations. Some of the key focuses in terms of what I'm interested around is about the future of work, in terms of agile digital HR, where things are going, and that's become a passion of mine to the point that it's about understanding where things like CVs are going, so that we make our skills and capabilities more applicable going forward. So not only do I do that, but career transition. So alongside my HR career to date, I have in fact sort of done pro bono career transition support, but more recently, since setting up by myself, I've done career transition for the last couple of years, mainly with ex-forces, Her Majesty's government, police, specialists, not just within this country, but also in other parts of the world. And over the last couple of years since going freelance, I've also started working with the CIPD, which is obviously the professional body for HR in the UK, and is now a global brand. So I've become the lead tutor on the HR Business Partner Program, but also have developed a number of courses around social recruiting, essential interview skills, coaching, mentoring, workforce planning, strategic HR, and so sort of have continued with that and continue to enjoy my work there. This has also sort of come about in terms of I've spent the last 7 years writing for Pathfinder, which some of you may have read. I've always written articles about employability, the future of work, changing nature of work, things that people need to be thinking about when they're going to the civvy street, and that's sort of gone on from my desire to give something back after 12 years with the Reserve Forces. So I started at 17 and a half as an infantryman with Princess Wales Regiment, TA as it was then, now the Army Reserve as we all know, and spent 7 years with the TA, and then later another 5 years with the Royal Auxiliary Air Force. So I'm quite passionate, as you can probably imagine, about the forces and giving people the best chance going forward in terms of their forces background. So back to you, Lisa. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Giles. So hopefully we're all going to be benefiting from your experience this evening. So what are we going to cover on today's webinar? Firstly, we're going to define what a CV is and how it's evolving into something new in this digital age. We're going to cover off the basic structure or framework to consider with some pointers. We're hopefully going to get rid of some of the myths about CVs, and there are a lot of myths out there, and also discuss other ways to profile capabilities in the modern employment space, which is ever changing. And finally, Giles will kind of summarise and give us all a few reminders. So before we get into that content, what we're going to do is just ask you guys out there a question, and you'll have the ability to answer that question on your screen shortly. So the question is, what do you feel about how many pages a CV should be? So answering A, B, or C there. So we'll give you a few minutes to answer that, and then we'll discuss those results. So the results of that then, 81% of you have said 2 pages as a complete document. 19% of you have said as long as you like, as long as it has context, and nobody felt that it would be C, it should cover 10 to 20 years of employment history. So what are your thoughts on that, Giles?
Well, it is a bit of a trick question, and the reason being is going back to this myth about a CV. Now, what's considered as best practice is 2 sides, but that's because best practice is always defined by school leavers and graduates in many ways. So as a result, if we look at their background and skills to date, they probably won't have anything that will fill beyond 2 pages. There's always been that mindset. Plus, we are greatly influenced by the US. The US have the resume model, which is 1 to 2 sides. So again, if you're applying for a job with a US company, which is usually a resume format, or if you are a fresh graduate with not a lot of experience, then it is probably down to 2 pages. But in reality, you can have quite a few more pages. Anything between 3 to 6 sides is acceptable. But what really is important is about context. You can have lots of content in there. You have context because in reality, people have between they say between 8 and 12 seconds these days to review a CV. So you've got to keep that in mind when you are looking at this CV and writing it, because it's got to be succinct, to the point, and attractive. Then the third point turns it should cover 10 to 20 years employment history. Realistically, as professionals, many people who are potentially retiring from the military, who still have a lot of work left in them and a lot of skills to give to CV Street, what we've got to be mindful of is that sometimes it is having a longer employment history. And with some sectors, particularly those in SIA related or perhaps the security sector, where further clearances are required, sometimes applications will require 10 to 20 years of that experience. So don't be scared to put it. But the question was a trick one. There is no one right answer. It's about context and be able to get your information across as appropriately as possible and understanding who you're applying for.
Brilliant. Thank you, Giles. So we'll just move on now to the next slide. Okay, so I'll take over from Lisa here in terms of, thank you very much for that, Lisa. In terms of what is a CV, well, by definition, obviously from the Latin, the translation, of course, is the course of your life, and it's the course of your professional or working life that people want to understand about. First and foremost, your CV is, and you need to be mindful of this, it is a legal document, because when you make an application for a role, you are applying the best of your knowledge. What you say is about you, and therefore, if you get a job as a result of it, and anything on CV is found to be untrue, then you could be deemed guilty of fraud. So it's a legal document. We've got to be mindful of what we'll put in there. It is good to polish a CV to make it look attractive, but always be true to what your background is. The second point is it's a baseline and a diagnostic. So by being a baseline, what I mean by that is it consolidates and rationalizes your career and capabilities to date. What it does, it gives you a chance to digest everything you've done and consider that, and then put it into a format and into a document that sells you as a person. It therefore becomes a baseline for any of your application forms, for your LinkedIn profile, or for job sites, because it's that baseline document you can then use for other things. When I say it's a diagnostic, what I mean by that, it allows you to think about your skills, identify what you've done in terms of your experience and your capabilities, and think about where your future path is and what you want to do in terms of aspirations, because your CV should be geared not just about what you've done, but to where you're going. And that's where you've got to be mindful of the kind of language, the style, and the things you bring out in your CV to ensure it's not just focusing on your past, but your employable future. If we move on to the providing a potential insight, this is what employers are looking for. It is your shop window for them to see something about you. Employers therefore get a feel for you, your style, and your language also become an indicator of you. So think about what that means. It is very much your professional brand. So in a day, in today's employment environment where we're talking about employer brand always being important,
in a more connected world where LinkedIn, social media, etc. are important, especially in the recruitment world. Your brand is very much your profile in your network, and therefore having a CV that reflects that and is consistent with your presence in the wider world is very important. So it becomes you as your professional brand. It does document your employability because it has to have information on there about your background, what you've done to date, and how you've done things. And it highlights your key capabilities. And the three things to focus and think about is really your skills, your knowledge, and experience, because they're the things that everyone looks for. So in terms of that, what do we mean? Well, first and foremost, the skills are quite simply, is what you're capable of doing, what you can do. They are your capabilities defined pure and simple. Secondly, it's your knowledge. What do you know? And then finally, your experience. How well practiced are you at something? Because then what we're doing is looking at a document that shows these three things and gives us an indicator of your expertise, your adaptability, and the behaviours you have as a professional. The thing to also consider is that there are a number of different variants of CV. There is no one perfect CV. So please, people do think about getting the perfect CV. It doesn't exist. I've never seen it. So to think about that in those terms, you've got to consider there are many variants. So, for example, if you were applying for a job in India and you're applying for perhaps in Germany for a job where they have the CV equivalent in the Lebenslauf, those kind of documents will be similar to what we call a chronological CV, but also have your picture on. So you've got to be mindful of cultural differences. In the US, we know is a resume, so that's a two-side document. But the three most common CVs that you'll find in circulation in the UK and used are the chronological, the skills-based, and the targeted CV. And they're the ones you might want to think about when you're using. So let's just give a sort of brief overview of those. The chronological CV is your most common. It's the familiar format we often see when we're applying or use CVs for the jobs we apply for. What it does is outlines your experience in reverse chronological order. Okay, so focus on that. It has distinct sections that mark out your education, your experience, your achievements. And what it is, to put it bluntly, is a logical progression of your career to date. But you have to be careful because people make assumptions from what they read, and you don't want to make the assumptions being wrong. So firstly, if you've changed roles quite a bit, now that's not a negative in today's world, but if you have changed roles quite a bit, make sure that there is some form of progression in your CV, because sometimes people get itchy feet about that. In the same light, you've got to be mindful that you've got disparate experience. What, again, is your future aspiration? You've got to align it appropriately. And if you are looking to change career directions as well, you've got to be mindful that someone's going to make a judgment upon what's in front of them. So if it says you've done something completely different to what you're applying for, you've got to bring out the transferable skills and capabilities in your CV that make that transfer relevant. Okay? So that's what we're looking at from a chronological. If we then move on to the skills-based CV, that's a bit different. That's one which demonstrates your evidence of your skills. So they come under skills headings. And the education and work experience sections usually sort of kept brief at the base. The style and format is quite hard difficult to organise, and it is useful if you want to focus on the key skills that the employer is looking for. But again, it's just one variant. The targeted CV is again a bit different, but that's about evidencing your experience and your responsibilities for a particular role. So what it'll do is bring together your experience, your qualification, your skills, and any achievements to highlight your capability and why you're best for the role. And that is presented under relevant headings that will be seen as part of the job spec. So again, these are three different CVs. The most popular one that we see is the chronological, but these are just three that we use in the UK. There are other forms, and they are growing because I've seen new ones that are coming out which are more like infograms. I've seen visual CVs, lots of different ones, but it's about what works for you in the sectors you're applying for. So have a think about that. And then finally, other options. Well, we're going to have a look at other ways that you profile your background in today's working world. But more importantly, that all starts from having a baseline, which is your CV, and having an idea of who you are and where you're going. So next slide, please.
No, that's great. Just quickly though, there, Giles, is that someone has just asked a question as to whether it's acceptable to mix the styles of CV, so have some kind of a hybrid style of CV, a mixture of perhaps reverse chronological and functional style. Is that something that you see often?
Yeah, and again, there is no perfect CV. It has to have context. If it provides the information in an attractive and succinct manner that the viewer can see very quickly and easily, then there is no style that doesn't fit.
Great, thank you. And I think the main message there is for it to be relevant to, to what you're trying to achieve. And thank you for that. So the 20th century candidate.
So to put things into context of where the CVs come from, where it's going, let's look at where it has come from. So if we talk about the 20th century candidate, back in the late 1980s or 1990s, whatever you want to look at, what we used to do was look for a job, usually through the press, through specialist media, or in the 90s, we sometimes used to find job sites as well. We would then type up a CV on a typewriter, usually one copy, and we might photocopy it, or if we're really good and really fast, we type lots of copy of it. Or if we were PC connected and PC capable or literate, we would then sort of create a CV online using Word documents. That would then be sent in a brown envelope to an employer with a covering letter to say, I'm applying for this job. Or if we were really sort of Gucci, we would use Hotmail, Yahoo, or other systems and email our CV with a soft copy of that letter. That was what the 20th century was. This is how we apply for jobs. And quite honestly, we haven't often changed in what we do. And a lot of employers haven't changed. And they still expect CV by email. They still expect perhaps even a hard copy. But we've got to be mindful of the changes and what's going on going forward. So let's look at the 21st century candidate now. So here we go. The next slide is the new 21st century candidate is very much mobile network connected. Okay, most of what we can do and what we have can be done via our mobile phones, our tablets, and other mobile devices. This is just a simple example of how a job applicant can now sit on the tube, or if they've got the connection on there, of course, via the wireless, or on the train or anywhere, and remain connected to the job market. We look on the left-hand side, we've got the various job sites and apps you can download to allow you to search for and apply for jobs, with Indeed being effectively the Google of the jobs world. Just below that, we've got Gmail, Skype, and Dropbox. These are ways for you to communicate via email or even interview via Skype, or store multiple copies of your CV for different sectors and different types of roles in Dropbox, which you can then pull out and attach to an email via Gmail. On the top right-hand side, we've got Glassdoor, which is what people call the TripAdvisor for work. So it gives you a chance to look at employers, what people are saying about them, how they operate. And then below that, we've got three sort of key social networks that people use: Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook, to search for, find out about jobs through their networks. And then finally, there's a small sort of icon there. That's a CV and resume builder. So what it can do is collate all the information you have from your social profile, perhaps LinkedIn or others, and actually create a very basic copy of your resume. So what we're seeing now is that the nature of work and how we apply for jobs is changing. And I've seen this with candidates doing it in real time, because people now and candidates are mobile, they're networked, they're connected beyond what we have. So thinking about that and your CV, this is why your CV is an important baseline, because it can allow other things to happen and you can connect it and get it in front of the people you need much more quickly and much more easily these days. So next slide.
Just one question that someone has asked about a CV style that they've seen on LinkedIn, which is a kind of one-page format with timeline and key skills. Is that something that's becoming more acceptable?
It is. And again, there is no one perfect CV, and that follows a similar resume model, because LinkedIn obviously is a US-led and run company, known by Microsoft now. So you'll see more of this happening, whereby it's about quick and easy access. And the same like when you're applying for roles on LinkedIn, some of them will not, you do not need to sort of send a CV, you do not need to go off of LinkedIn to apply via a different website. You can apply direct via LinkedIn, because it formalizes with algorithms the various pieces of data on your application, your background, that then mean the employer can make a judgment. So it may well be that, going back, think about the future, the CV doesn't exist anymore. It becomes something completely different, and this is where the things like your LinkedIn profile are sort of taking over.
And obviously that means that people really should be paying as much attention to the content of their LinkedIn profile as they are to the content of their CV. It's just as important.
Exactly, but the CV is your baseline. If you don't spend time looking at what is your background, where have you come from, that will not give you the information you therefore need to populate LinkedIn, because LinkedIn has various sections in there to make it easier for you to put the data in, but you've got to think about it before to maximize that opportunity, because LinkedIn is optimized for Google. So when people put in the name about you, they are likely to find your LinkedIn profile. So your CV is already online and out there. So this is where consistency is really important with your CV and your LinkedIn profile.
Perfect. Thank you, Giles.
No worries.
So we're now going to move on to another poll question. You'll see that on your screen shortly. So where should your education and qualification section be on your CV? So I'll give you a couple of minutes just to respond to that. Waiting for a couple more answers there. Apologies here, I don't know what's happened to the screen.
Please don't ask me to sing in the interim, please, Lisa. It's not going to be healthy for everyone.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Apologies, sorry.
So we've got the slide there. So it's interesting that most people think at the end to support your employment history. You've then got anywhere you wish to put it slightly after at the beginning for clarity.
Yeah,
again,
exactly. So most people have gone to B, and what are your thoughts on that, Giles?
I think, again, this comes down to personal preference and relevance. Personally, I always put it at the beginning for clarity. And the reason being is that most employers will look for specialist skills and knowledge, which could include qualifications. And that is the first thing that a lot of IT systems as well, through applicant tracking, will look for as well, keynotes and points. So therefore, if it's up front, if there are certain things that are, have to be expected part of the role, which is a degree in a certain area, a specific qualification, it could be Prince 2, or it could be a health and safety qualification. If you've got it up front that says, I've got these, that's already tipped the very basic bits that are needed for the role before they concentrate on the rest. So this is why I do advise it is better at the front, but there is no reason it can't be at the base of the CV to support the other information. It's just thinking about, if someone's got to think about, is this person a graduate to have the relevant qualifications, they're going to have to look at the bottom of the CV and then go back to the top to read through it. That, again, wastes the precious time if you've only got 8 to 12 seconds. So that would be my answer.
Giles. So thank you very much, Giles. So we're now moved on to your next slide.
Okay, so look at the simple CV format. This is the basic CV format for a chronological CV, which again is the most familiar and common CV that you'll see. If you have been working with the CTP, they'll probably cover this or the skills-based one. So this is just it's a few bullets really to describe what should be in them. So first and foremost, it's your contact details. It should have your name, the moniker that you go by, any particular qualifications that might sit after your name. It will have your address, your email, and your contact telephone number. It should have information. It's optional whether you then have any social profiles, which could be your LinkedIn profile or your Twitter. And it is also optional to have your nationality, because that might be relevant if you're applying for particular roles, because it has to have a national status. But I would avoid, and recommend you do so, avoid anything to do with age, your gender, or other information that could be deemed as too personal, because what we're trying to do is avoid people making assumptions about you or make a decision about you before actually seeing you, which is unfortunate unconscious bias, which we see in some CV, so people reading CVs. We all know it's illegal. It still happens. That's the problem. So then we move on to a professional summary, and this needs to be just a brief summary about you, ideally probably about 2 paragraphs max. The first paragraph should really summarize your professional experience. What's your background? What's your skill set? How long have you been doing it? What kind of sectors and employment opportunities have you had to date? The next section should be a brief about your personal competencies. What is your team building ability? What's your leadership skills? How have you illustrated these? It's more about your behaviours and your personal competencies that's under that section. Under that, it is again optional, but some CVs will have achievements attached to them. So if you've got certain headings like program management or health and safety, it's then having a brief line under that that says succinctly, what is your background and how can you prove this? That's an optional format that people do have as part of the CVs. Then it's education and qualifications, as per the advice I gave you before, and it's in reverse chronological order. So it's talking about your most recent qualifications first. Be mindful again that you shouldn't put all your qualifications on there. Think about what's relevant, what's appropriate, what they're looking for, because they've got 8 to 12 seconds to see your CV. Think about what really works and what's really important. Then it moves on to employment history, and you have to be brief with this. So you've got to think about the time of work you're working for the individual or the organisation, the title of the job you're doing, as well as obviously the employer you're doing for, and then using bullet points, be as succinct as possible to highlight your responsibilities, duties, and achievements you did in that role. The other thing to be mindful of is if you're a manager, you've also got to, or a leader, you've got to think about the things you're responsible for in terms of value of assets, the people that you looked after, how many people are responsible for training, all those kind of things which qualify your background. Then it's moving on to hobbies and interests. Now, a lot of people knock them on the head. Now, that's a personal choice. And on a resume, I would advise you probably didn't put hobbies and interests. However, on a CV, I have seen this whereby a manager, a hiring manager, has looked at two CVs that have been very similar backgrounds. But then when they've seen a shared interest, they've gone for that CV because they're looking at the wider person. And hobbies and interests do show that you have wider interests and stuff outside of work that are sometimes then investigated as part of HR interviews, which may happen as part of the recruitment process. Then people ask about references, whether you should put references on the CV. I would advise you don't. I would put just simply available upon request. And the reason that is because, number one, you're disclosing third-party information, which you may not have permission to do so, which could be a breach of data protection. But secondly, not everyone is professional out there, and there could be some recruiters that will use that information to start to approach those individuals as potential targets for recruitment or to sell things to. So you've got to be mindful of that. So that would be my advice on the simple format for a CV. Next page, please.
Yeah, just to add to what you've said, Giles, a silly point, but I have both interviewed a person based on something they wrote in their interest and been interviewed myself on the basis of something that I wrote on my CV regarding interest. So I think it is true that it can often be a kind of common ground thing that people, it might distinguish you from the crowd.
That's exactly it. That's, and I've seen that in terms of an individual came in for an interview. I didn't think there was going to be some common ground, but the manager clicked on something that was in the hobbies and interests. That led to a wider conversation, and the individual was employed. It didn't matter necessarily what the skills were. They were able to create a connection. And this goes back to the simple 4 C's that I wrote about in one of my Pathfinder articles, and that is that there are 4 C's that we as humans usually assess people about in interview. The first is capabilities, which comes out of the CV, initial questions. Do we think someone is able to do the job? The next thing is about communication. Can we articulate and communicate with that person? Can we, do they respond to you and can you respond otherwise to them? Then it's about connection. Do you feel you can connect with that person? Can you communicate effectively? Do you feel you could work with them? Do you feel you could trust them? And then finally, it's culture is the final C, which is, okay, they can work with me and work with the person that I am, but can they work with the team around us and the wider organisation? And if we look at that in context, 75% of what happens in interviews is not necessarily about you as your physical, your background in terms of your physical experience. It's actually more about the person you are, whether you connect and whether you come across well in that interview.
Yes, absolutely. I would agree with that.
Okay, so moving on to the next slide is about key considerations. So what we've got here, just things and pointers that you need to think about when you're writing your CV or considering updating your CV. First and foremost, going back to the point I made at the beginning, content needs context. Okay, you can write lots about your background, and I'm sure that most people have some really interesting stuff to put, but it's got to have context. It's got to be relevant and appropriate for the role that you're looking for, and it's got to have impact, because you want the right person to see the right information to have the right impact about you. It's then also about balancing the technical and personal capabilities. It's not just about the way, the kind of technologies or methods or processes you've used as a manager or a project manager or a technical specialist. It's also about your personal capabilities, how you've engaged motivated people, how you've been part of the team, how you've connected with with customers or clients to get the job done. It's about getting that balance, because the work is human at the end of the day. It's not just about machine mindsets. We also need to avoid potential unconscious bias. This is what I referred to previously. And the fact is, if we give too much information, people may make an assumption or a decision on what they see on a CV without ever seeing you. And that means moving things like gender and age, etc., because people will sit down and think about that and then think, oh, if they're more mature, then will they work with my workforce? Again, that's illegal, but people still do it. And we have to avoid, therefore, giving information that allows them to make an assumption that we don't want them to do. Currency of data is key. That's important. Your CV should be updated. It is a live document. When you do things, keep it up to date. And in this day and age, because we have, the technologies we have, you can keep a soft copy or multiple copies of your CV via Dropbox, via your C drive, or wherever. There is no excuse for not to do it, and it's a good thing to do to keep it into practice. Because there'll be one point where you go, can you send me a copy of your CV? And you'll go, do you know what? Yeah, I'll just update it. I'll get it to you within 24 hours. And before you know it, it's a week later, because you haven't had the time to do it. So just spending a little time to keep things updated so you've got a live document, it really matters. Business is very much about numbers. That goes back to my point around, if you're establishing the fact you're a manager, you've got to use numbers, because numbers is the language of business. Wherever we are in the world, it doesn't matter what language you speak, numbers matter. And that means that, if you're looking at you are a leader or a manager and you've looked after a fleet of vehicles or particular assets, give it a pound or a dollar value, depending obviously on the end person that's looking at your CV. Think about the number of people you've managed and the budgets you've been responsible, you've signed up. All this kind of stuff, the numbers bit really matters to give an indication, if not qualifying your capabilities as a leader and as a manager. Then it's about highlighting your management leadership capability. Don't forget that people bit. Talk about where you've led particular initiatives, where you've changed people's mindsets, that kind of thing, but put into the context of what you're applying for. And don't assume people know what you mean. Jargon is used throughout CVs, and it can be beneficial to some extent if you're applying for a very specialist role, because it means you speak the language. But be mindful of that language not being understood by everyone, because even though the final hiring manager may understand what you're putting in terms of technical language, the recruiter that might be doing it as a technical recruiter, or the HR person looking at it, may not speak the same language or misunderstand it. So be mindful of what you put in there, and don't assume people know exactly what you mean. This is why it's good to test it with friends and families or people in your network, to understand, is this what I'm putting, is this right? And then finally, just use bullet points, be clear and concise. Bullet points is a nice, easy way to put information out there. A lot of people write paragraphs in CVs. Think about how much time it takes to read a paragraph, if you've got 8 to 12 seconds to really get someone to look at your CV, or to read a bullet point. And that's all I really need to say on that, because that gives it some indication of how important it is. And that's that slide done. Any questions on that otherwise? Okay.
There are a few questions, but I'm going to keep them to the end.
Okay.
So we're moving on now to a final poll question. If you can all give some thought to how many copies of a CV do you really need, and is this one that you regularly update, multiple copies for different sectors, or one that you can adapt? So if you can give some thought to that, and we'll discuss those responses shortly. Okay, so we've got the responses there, so quite close, with 54% saying one generic CV you adapt, 42% saying multiple copies and very few people saying just one. Well, what are your views on that, Giles?
And it's a good question, because the reason why I ask this question, because I ask myself this question every time I need to look at my own CV or the CVs that I work with. To have one that you regularly update may work for you if you are in a specific sector and a specialist where you only need that probably one CV. That will work for you if that's the case for you. However, multiple copies for different sectors roles, if you are moving across sectors or have that experience, it is worthwhile having multiple copies. As I said, you can store that on your PC's drive or on a Dropbox in a virtual cloud space. There is the opportunity these days to do so. And it is worthwhile having multiple copies, because you might bring out different things that constantly hone the capabilities of your CV before you get it out there. And then finally, the one generic CV you can adapt, it's very similar to question A, because at the end of the day, it is about having a general CV that you can adapt and profile. Again, it's up to you, but you can start with that generic CV and then make multiple copies as part of B. So that, again, it isn't a right answer, because it comes down to what time you have, what works for you, what's specific to your sector. And that takes time to do, to actually understand that.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Giles. So moving on to the next slide then, and professional
this is a bit of a sort of a colourful slide that I've created, because what I wanted to show is that the CV, again, going back to my point, is your shop window. That's where employers understand more about you, your potential, and the way you potentially fit with their organisation. But the changing nature of the work and the environment we work in means that there are other ways that your CV becomes that baseline to then become other things that we use. And there are great ways for you to then professional profile what you do in other areas. So most people these days have heard of LinkedIn and social media. So there's another way that you can create your connection, your network, and use your CV as the key to the door. But what you do is you build the relationships and connections, make those into real life if possible, and then you can build your connections to then increase your profile as a professional. It's a great way of doing things. People now are also doing what's called vlogging or vlogging, depending on your preference, whereby what they're doing is creating a CV of themselves online. You can find them on YouTube, you can find them on some other sites as well, where people are actually keeping logs of themselves and their capabilities and publishing them, so that they're giving an indication of their expertise and therefore building their professional profile online, which again is pervasive then in terms of presence. Articles, so if you are a specialist in a certain area, it's a great way to write for a specialist press or specialist magazine, that you can then get your article put out there which profiles your capability. And if it's published, it then becomes part of your employment portfolio in terms of showing what you've done and what you're capable of in terms of your expertise. And that in the same light goes on to blogging. Blogging is a very simple way now that we can do things for free. So you can do it by your LinkedIn profile, you can do it by WordPress and others, where you can build your professional profile by writing about your expertise, writing about things that are changing in the market and the sector, your thoughts on particular areas as they develop, which is important again for profiling your capability. There are sites out there very similar to LinkedIn, which are called About Me as an example, whereby you can also create your own little website for a small commission. I think something like between $5 and $15. I'm not sure on the price, so please don't quote me. But again, that becomes almost like your personal professional website that people can view in real time wherever you are across the world. But again, it's a personal choice whether you want that as a little website of your own or just use your LinkedIn profile. The resume, of course, is a traditional model, but it is a way of personal profiling because it makes you condense your capabilities into one or two sides and means that also you can potentially work with US employers because you've already got that on standby. But again, it's a great way to sort of consolidate your background, your capabilities. Microblogging has also become a way of professionally building your profile, and I'm living proof of that. Microblogging, to put it bluntly, is using tools like Twitter. Twitter was something I didn't understand back in 2012. I've been on LinkedIn since 2007, thoroughly enjoyed it, but realised I was one-trick pony. I looked at Twitter because purely I didn't understand it. Facebook was for friends, and I didn't go on there until later, actually. I only joined back in February of 2016. But Twitter I just didn't get. But when I started to play with it, I realised within 24 hours, and the penny dropped, that it is a dynamic communication tool. It can be used to build networks capabilities in terms of reaching out to people, but also sharing knowledge, articles, thoughts, etc. very quickly. And I've seen that develop into ways people are now doing conferences online and other ways to get hold of knowledge, but also build connections with people beyond tools like LinkedIn that allow you then to increase your professional profile in a wide space. And that leads to sites like Quora, which people may have come across. Quora is an expert Q&A site. You can register as an expert, you can register as someone who wants to learn, but it's a site whereby you can profile expertise if you're in a specific area. You can respond to Q&As. People can ask specific questions about certain things, and you can give your advice and your thoughts. It becomes like a crowdsourcing model. So again, once more, there are more ways to profile your capabilities. The CV becomes a baseline document, but the rest of these different opportunities offer you a chance to increase your pervasive presence online and through other parties to make sure you can then network for the opportunities that you want. And that leads me on to the final slides. So some key reminders. Going back to my point, the CV is a legal document. Do not lie. I don't wish to treat anyone like children, but it is about making sure that you do put on what's true on your CV. People have been taken to court, fined, etc. for doing so, and criminal charges have been raised. The CV is not globally ubiquitous. So, one CV model is not the same anywhere and everywhere. Going back to my point about the Lebenslauf in Germany or the Indian CV, they are very different. So you've got to consider different formats that may be used depending on the employer that you're applying for and the country that they operate in. Currency of data is key in your CV. The more up to date it is, the more relevant it's going to be. That's what's really important. And don't let people make assumptions. So be careful, mindful of what you put in the CV and what they could think as a result. You want them to think the positives to give the right impact, so be mindful about what you share and do not feed that unconscious bias we spoke about. The CV is the key to the door that you open it. Again, the CV is a baseline. It's a document that really allows people to get an idea about you. But it's you, once you get into the interview, you build that connection, you talk to people, that really matters. This is why it's important to get the right CV, but going through the process in terms of recruitment, it's more about you. And then finally, practice makes perfect. This talks about what I call the 3 C's. What we need to do is when we're writing our CV, or when we're going on to interviews, the more we do things, the more we sort of write the CV, the more we become more perfect, not so much perfect, I suppose, per se, but the more we perfect our style and capability to do so. There's 3 things that we build up. Firstly, it's our confidence. We can do it. It's our capability. We can do it well. Finally, our credibility, because we can do it well, and it gets us the jobs we want. And if we can build on those 3 C's, we feel more confident as potential employees and as professionals in the market space.
Thank you very much, Giles. I think they're all very pertinent reminders. And I particularly like the one about keeping your CV updated, the currency of your CV. People quite often land a new job, they think they've done it, tick the box, and that they don't have to think about their CV anymore. Whereas actually, while you're in the job and current and live in it, that's the best time to be updating it, keeping it ready for action. And as you said, you never know when someone might ask you for your CV, and what you don't want is to miss an opportunity because your CV wasn't up to date.
Exactly, and especially in the consulting space, which a lot of people move into these days, especially from the military environment. Consulting space means that you're probably moving to multiple projects, running at different times, and therefore you forget everything you've done. But if you can write a brief liner as a reminder in your CV, then creating this generic CV you can then adapt or making multiple copies. It's up to you what your preference is. But what you can do is keep that up to date so you don't forget. And when you again go for employment opportunities elsewhere, or someone talks about an opportunity for you, you already have it there. Because also in the consulting space, it's not just about your CV being used with for an external opportunity. Your CV is often used internally with the organisation to apply for other jobs or to apply for new consulting assignments. So it's about keeping it current for the benefits of your own good.
Brilliant, thank you, Giles. So a summary here.
So I thought I'd just going back to the classic 3s that I like to use. Firstly, there is no perfect CV. There are a number of different CV formats which we've covered in brief, but there is no one perfect CV. It's about perfecting the CV that works for you and the type of roles and jobs you want to go for. The second point is context overrules content every time. You can have a CV that's 12 sides that has an amazing career and background today, But if the individual who has, who's reading it doesn't have the time to read 12 sides, you've got to be mindful of that. So it's about having the context that is going to have, as I said, the right impact with the right people at the right time to make sure they then want to invite you to interview. And then finally, the CV is the baseline that defines your profile. If you can write a good starter for a CV that then you can build upon into building a generic copy that you can adapt or building multiple copies that you can save, that CV then starts to build an effective LinkedIn profile because you can use that to populate the information. You can then use it to populate social media to remind you of other things. It becomes a very simple baseline for you to create a career for yourself longer term.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Giles. I think that's all been really useful. We're going to move now on to some questions, and I've got a few that I have been making a note of as we've been going along, and then obviously if people do still have questions, we might have time to answer a few extra. So if you've got anything burning that you want Giles to answer, please do send it in. One person asks, and perhaps this ties in with your summary, Giles, obviously different people have different ideas about CVs and you should always try to make it relevant, but do you have a top 3 red lines not to cross in a CV? What are the top 3 things that most recipients of CVs would not like to see?
Oh, I don't know, because I don't think... It's a very interesting question because, again, I think some of it's common sense. So let's make common sense comparison. First thing, I would want to see on the contact details a dodgy email if it was me. So something that was explicit or inappropriate, it's not going to do you any favours because that already gives you a poor professional impression. I think the next red line is probably repeating the information too much in there because what you're trying to do is create a CV that an applicant tracking system is going to pick up. A lot of CV people and recruiters now advise you put certain words or certain things in a CV. I can understand that, but not all applicant tracking systems are the same. They don't pick out the same information. And I'll give an example. SME can be used to say, subject matter expert, but it can also mean small, medium enterprise. So it depends how that particular ATS, applicant tracking system, is tailored and calibrated for it. So be mindful of putting in language just because it's going to try and get you an interview, because it won't always work. And as to the final point, the red line is, do not put your references on there. And under any circumstances, just put on there that you are available upon request in terms of your references, because you don't want to give away third-party information to people that you have no control over. Hello?
Thanks. Sorry, Giles. A couple of people have asked whether it's appropriate for photo to be on a UK CV. Do you have any views on that?
Personal preference. Again, it's up to you. If it's a smart photo and it works, great. It's up to you. It takes up space, but more importantly, going back to unconscious bias, some people will make a decision based on your photo whether they want to see you or not. I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's appropriate. But at the end of the day, people are human. They have this unconscious bias, and some people will still do it despite what the law says. So it's up to you. I think if you want to do it and show that you're professional, that's great. But you've got a LinkedIn profile as well. I would avoid it personally.
Yes, I agree with you there, Giles. I think LinkedIn, if people really want to see what you look like, they can look at LinkedIn. I think some industries, such as perhaps media, it's quite commonplace to have a photo. But outside of that, I would say it's not very common.
And I would agree. But again, it depends also the country that you're operating in, because, as I said, it's expected in Germany, it's expected on CV in India, so be mindful of local bias and local practices.
Someone has asked about the professional summary. Is it better to have that in bullet points or in a kind of grammatically correct paragraph?
Again, I've seen both, and I like both as both an ex-recruiter and an HR professional. Personally, I prefer the paragraph because what you're doing is, if the rest of the CV is in bullet points, you're at least getting an idea of some ability to articulate information in a brief and concise manner. Those two paragraphs allow you to have some idea about that and how they come across. But that professional summary is also well written in bullet points as well. It's just, of course, how does it look with regards to the rest of the CV? Sometimes it may look too much like a long list of different things you've done just by bullet points. But again, it depends on your personal preferences and potentially the employers that you're going to be working for, because everyone has different preferences because we're all human.
One person has asked on that, how do you tell what style an employer would prefer? I mean, my personal
The best
view
thing
on
is
that,
ask.
yeah, absolutely, it's just to ask. And if you don't want to ask HR department, perhaps try and ask someone who already works for the company.
Exactly that. It's about using a network. So whether it's working, finding a person in the organisation that can help you, it's about asking members of your network that have worked in that industry or in that particular organisation, or potentially asking again the HR department or the recruiter this way, what would their advice be? You can only go on that. There is no guarantee for any of this, but it's about then using your information, using your I suppose your capabilities to gather information to get the right format that works. That's what really matters. So it's about connecting with people and asking the questions. Never be scared to ask, because the least the least responsive people are not going to give you the right answer, or not give you an answer at all. They're more often going to give you the right answer if it's appropriate.
One other question is, if people have got training that is booked but not yet undertaken. So just as an example, a project management qualification that is perhaps desirable for a role, which they are booked on but haven't yet gone on the course, is it appropriate to mention that that's booked, or would you wait until the qualification has been achieved?
I would, again, personal choice and context. If you're due to start it very shortly, or if you are currently on it, then put it on there, because at least it shows you're underway. If it's going to be 2 years down the line, there's no point. You've got to again have context, because I say we just put it on the CV, you could cancel it. But if you're already on the course or very shortly due to start, then I think it's worthwhile considering. But again, be mindful that people will make a judgment on it. So have a think about putting in there, if you are going to put it on there, due to start date at, or in the middle of the course. Because I've been working with a couple of individuals who are exactly that, underway on their courses at the moment, and we've looked at what that should say. We've put underway, or qualification, or results expected in certain or on a certain date.
Yeah, so I agree with you there, Giles. There's one final question which is perhaps a bit complicated to answer briefly, but it's around how to explain military job titles. Do you have any kind of brief top tips for people out there as to how to cut through some of the jargon that they often find in their military job titles?
Yeah, I think, to be honest with you, the CV world share the same. It's very hard sometimes to benchmark job titles when in CV Street you've got people called production ninjas, you've got people called principal executive officer, these kind of jobs. So don't worry, it's similar in the CV world as well. But I think that the best things to do are, firstly, contact organisations like the Officers Association, get some idea about what's going on in the marketplace, speak to career consultants to get those thoughts. I would also have a look at what your job is, and then benchmarking it with job sites like Indeed. You can search for particular jobs, understand what the benchmark job title is, and make sure that's irrelevant transfers or translates appropriately. And then also ask around your network, your connections. What does your job look like in CV Street? Whether it is with current employers or current people who have just left the military and walked into CV Street, or people you already know have been in CV Street for some time. It's use your network, ask the questions. But I would go through that sort of process. Whether it's you're contacting the OA, the RFBA as well, in terms of what their thoughts are. perhaps your network, or particularly resettlement advisors like Raja, perhaps the REMI, or any group or trusted individual in your network that has either the military experience or background that can help you, then don't be scared to ask, because they can then translate it. And that's the briefest response I could probably give.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much, Giles. I appreciate it was a tricky question, but
a good question. Yeah.
Really. And I think that I would absolutely agree with you in terms of using the resources that are out there. The OA obviously is one of them, but I'll also look at what your job it entails and how it's relevant to the job that you're applying for. So think about the skills that you're using in your job and how best to convey that. And often your job title is in bold, so people pick up on it quite quickly. So what a good opportunity for you to mention operations or projects or training, if that's part of the message that you're trying to convey. I think that, unfortunately, that's all the questions that we have time for this evening, but hopefully people have found it useful. And just one final poll for you for our benefit, just to, for us to improve the service that we offer, is just to ask you, hopefully, how much use you've had from tonight's webinar. So if you can just perhaps give us some answers there, that would be great. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. And so, all that remains for me really now is to thank Giles very much for his time this evening. We've been very fortunate in being able to tap into your expertise, Giles, and we're really grateful to you. And we're looking forward to some future articles in Pathfinder in the coming year.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, Lisa, and I wish everyone success going forward. And again, if people want to reach out and sort of drop me a line or connect with you via LinkedIn or Twitter, please feel free. I'm always happy to answer questions or help in any way I can, because it's all about the network. It's not what you can do for yourself, it's how you can help others to do what you need to do.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Giles. We really appreciate it. And good evening to everyone.
Thank you.